Part 3. The First Invasion of Britain, 55 BC. 20. It was now near the end of summer, and winter sets in early in those parts, because all that coast of Gaul faces north. Nevertheless, Caesar made active preparations for an expedition to Britain, because he knew that in almost all the Gallic campaigns, the Gauls had received reinforcements from the Britons. Even if there was no time for a campaign that season, he thought it would be of great advantage to him merely to visit the island, to see what its inhabitants were like, and to make himself acquainted with the lie of the land, the harbours, and the landing places. Of all this the Gauls knew next to nothing, for in the ordinary way traders are the only people who visit Britain, and even they only know that part of the coast which faces Gaul. And so, although he interviewed traders from all parts, he could not ascertain anything about the size of the island, the character and strength of the tribes which inhabited it, their manner of fighting and customs, or the harbours capable of accommodating a large fleet of big ships. 21. In order to get this information before risking an expedition, he sent a warship in command of Volusinus, whom he considered a suitable man for the job. His orders were to make a general reconnaissance and return as soon as he could. Meanwhile, Caesar marched the whole army into the country of the Morini, from which there was the shortest crossing to Britain, and ordered ships to assemble there from all the neighbouring districts, as well as a fleet that had been built the previous summer for the Venetian War. His design had become known in the meantime, and when the news was brought by traders to the Britons, envoys were sent by a number of tribes offering to give hostages and submit to Rome. Caesar gave them audience, made them generous promises, and urged them to abide by their resolve. He then sent them home, accompanied by Commius, whom he had made king of the Atrebates after the conquest of that tribe, a man of whose courage, judgment, and loyalty he had a high opinion, and who was greatly respected in Britain. He instructed Commius to visit as many tribes as possible, to urge them to entrust themselves to the protection of Rome, and to announce his impending arrival. Volusinus reconnoitred the coast as far as he could without disembarking and putting himself in the power of the natives, which he dared not do, and returned 4 days later with his report. 22. While Caesar was waiting in the country of the Morini for his fleet to be assembled, a large section of the tribe sent envoys to apologize for their previous hostile action, pleading that they were foreigners and ignorant of Roman ways, and promising to obey his commands in future. Caesar thought this very fortunate. He did not want to leave an enemy in his rear, yet it would have been too late in the season to start another campaign, and the expedition to Britain was much more important than the conquest of these petty tribes. He therefore demanded a large number of hostages, and on their arrival accepted the submission of the Morini. In due course, about 80 transports, which Caesar considered sufficient to convey 2 legions, were obtained and assembled, and also a number of warships which were assigned to the quaestor, the generals, and the officers of the auxiliary troops. Besides these, there were 18 transports at a point 8 miles along the coast, which were allotted to the cavalry. The remainder of the army was entrusted to Sabinus and Cotta, with orders to march against the Menapii and those clans of the Morini which had not sent envoys. Another general, Publius Sulpicius Rufus, was ordered to hold the harbour, and was given a force considered adequate for the purpose. 23. After the completion of these arrangements, Caesar took advantage of favourable weather and set sail about midnight, ordering the cavalry to proceed to the farther port, embark there, and follow him. As these conducted the operation too slowly, their transports were carried back to land by the tide. Caesar himself reached Britain with the first ships about 9 o'clock in the morning, and saw the enemy's forces posted on all the hills. The lie of the land at this point was such that javelins could be hurled from the cliffs right onto the narrow beach enclosed between them and the sea. Caesar thought this a quite unsuitable place for landing, and therefore rode at anchor until 3 o'clock, in order to give the rest of the ships time to come up. Meanwhile, he assembled the generals and military tribunes and, telling them what he had learned from Volusinus, explained his plans. He warned them that the exigencies of warfare, and particularly of naval operations in which things move rapidly and the situation is constantly changing, required the instant execution of every order. On dismissing the officers, he found that both wind and tidal current were in his favour. He therefore gave the signal for weighing anchor, and after proceeding about 7 miles, ran his ships aground on an evenly sloping beach free of obstacles. 24. The natives, on realizing his intention, had sent forward their cavalry and a number of the chariots which they are accustomed to use in warfare. The rest of their troops followed close behind, and were ready to oppose the landing. The Romans were faced with very grave difficulties. The size of the ships made it impossible to run them aground except in fairly deep water, and soldiers, unfamiliar with the ground, with their hands full, and weighed down by the heavy burden of their arms, had at the same time to jump down from the ships, get a footing in the waves, and fight the enemy, who, standing on dry land or advancing only a short way into the water, fought with all their limbs unencumbered and on perfectly familiar ground, boldly hurling javelins and galloping their horses, which were trained to this kind of work. These perils frightened our soldiers, who were quite unaccustomed to battles of this kind, with the result that they did not show the same alacrity and enthusiasm as they usually did in battles on dry land. 25. Seeing this, Caesar ordered the warships, which were swifter and easier to handle than the transports, and likely to impress the natives more by their unfamiliar appearance, to be removed a short distance from the others, and then to be rowed hard and run ashore on the enemy's right flank, from which position slings, bows, and artillery could be used by men on deck to drive them back. This maneuver was highly successful. Scared by the strange shape of the warships, the motion of the oars, and the unfamiliar machines, the natives halted and then retreated a little. But as the Romans still hesitated, chiefly on account of the depth of the water, the man who carried the eagle of the 10th Legion, after praying to the gods that his action might bring good luck to the legion, cried in a loud voice, "Jump down, comrades, unless you want to surrender our eagle to the enemy. I, at any rate, mean to do my duty to my country and my general." With these words, he leapt out of the ship and advanced towards the enemy with the eagle in his hands. At this, the soldiers, exhorting each other not to submit to such a disgrace, jumped with one accord from the ship, and the men from the next ships, when they saw them, followed them and advanced against the enemy. 26. Both sides fought hard, but as the Romans could not keep their ranks or get a firm foothold or follow their proper standards, and men from different ships fell in under the first standard they came across, great confusion resulted. The enemy knew all the shallows, and when they saw from the beach small parties of soldiers disembarking one by one, they galloped up and attacked them at a disadvantage, surrounding them with superior numbers, while others would throw javelins at the right flank of a whole group. Caesar therefore ordered the warships' boats and the scouting vessels to be loaded with troops, so that he could send help to any point where he saw the men in difficulties. As soon as the soldiers had got a footing on the beach, and had waited for all their comrades to join them, they charged the enemy and put them to flight, but could not pursue very far, because the cavalry had not been able to hold their course and make the island. This was the one thing that prevented Caesar from achieving his usual success. 27. The defeated enemy, as soon as they rallied after their flight, hastened to send an embassy to ask for peace, promising to give hostages and carry out Caesar's commands. With these envoys came Commius the Atrebatian, whom Caesar had sent on ahead to Britain, as said above. When he had disembarked and was delivering Caesar's message to them in the character of an ambassador, the natives had arrested and bound him. Now, after the battle, they sent him back, and in asking for peace, threw the blame for this proceeding on the common people, begging Caesar to pardon an error due to ignorance. Caesar reproached them for making war on him without provocation, after sending envoys to the continent of their own accord to sue for peace, but said that he would pardon their ignorance and demanded hostages. Some of these they handed over at once. The rest, they said, would have to be fetched from a distance and should be delivered in a few days' time. Meanwhile, they bade their men return to the fields, and the chiefs began to come from all parts to solicit Caesar's favour for themselves and their tribes. 28. Peace was thus concluded. On the 4th day after Caesar's arrival in Britain, the 18 transports on which the cavalry had been embarked, as mentioned above, sailed from the northern port before a gentle breeze. When they were approaching Britain and were visible from the camp, such a violent storm suddenly arose that none of them could hold its course. Some were driven back to their starting point. Others, at great peril, were swept westwards to the south of the island. In spite of the danger, they cast anchor, but as they were being filled with water by the waves, they were forced to stand out to sea into the darkness of the night and return to the continent. 29. It happened to be full moon that night, at which time the Atlantic tides are particularly high, a fact unknown to the Romans. The result was that the warships used in the crossing, which had been beached, were waterlogged, and the transports, which were riding at anchor, were knocked about by the storm without the soldiers having any chance of interfering to save them. A number of ships were shattered, and the rest, having lost their cables, anchors, and the remainder of their tackle, were unusable, which naturally threw the whole army into great consternation, for they had no other vessels in which they could return, nor any materials for repairing the fleet, and, since it had been generally understood that they were to return to Gaul for the winter, they had not provided themselves with a stock of grain for wintering in Britain. 30. On learning of this accident, the British chiefs who had assembled after the battle to execute Caesar's commands put their heads together. Knowing that Caesar had no cavalry, ships, or corn, and inferring the weakness of his forces from the small size of the camp, which was all the smaller because he had come without most of the heavy luggage, they decided that their best course was to renew hostilities, to hinder the legions from obtaining corn and other supplies, and to prolong the war into the winter. If this army was conquered or prevented from returning, they felt confident that no one would come across to invade Britain. Accordingly, after renewing their promises of mutual loyalty, they slipped away one by one from the camp and secretly called up once more the men who had returned to the fields. 31. Although Caesar had not yet heard of their intention, the disaster which had overtaken his fleet, and the fact that they were no longer sending hostages, led him to anticipate what was coming. He therefore prepared for anything that might happen. Corn was brought in daily from the fields. Timber and bronze from the most severely damaged vessels was used to repair the others, and naval equipment was ordered to be sent from the continent. By the energetic efforts of the soldiers, all but 12 ships were saved and rendered tolerably seaworthy. 32. While this work was proceeding, one legion, as usual, had been sent out to get corn, in this case the 7th. Nothing had yet occurred to raise any suspicion of a fresh attack, and some of the Britons were still working in the fields, while others were actually going backwards and forwards to the camp. Suddenly, the guards on duty at the gate reported to Caesar that an unusually large cloud of dust was visible in the direction in which the legion had gone. Caesar guessed the truth, that the natives had hatched a new scheme, and ordered the cohorts on guard duty to set out with him in the direction indicated. 2 of the others to relieve them, and the rest to arm and follow immediately. After going some way, he saw that the legion was hard pressed by enemy forces and holding its ground with difficulty, packed closely and pelted with missiles from all directions. For as the corn had already been cut everywhere except in one place, the enemy had expected that our men would go there and had hidden by night in the woods. Then, when the soldiers were scattered and busy cutting corn, with their arms laid down, they had made a sudden attack, killing a few and throwing the rest into confusion before they could form up, and also surrounding them with cavalry and chariots. 33. In chariot fighting, the Britons begin by driving all over the field, hurling javelins, and generally the terror inspired by the horses and the noise of the wheels are sufficient to throw their opponents' ranks into disorder. Then, After making their way between the squadrons of their own cavalry, they jump down from the chariots and engage on foot. In the meantime, their charioteers retire a short distance from the battle and place the chariots in such a position that their masters, if hard pressed by numbers, have an easy means of retreat to their own lines. Thus they combine the mobility of cavalry with the staying power of infantry, and by daily training and practice they attain such proficiency that even on a steep incline they are able to control the horses at full gallop and to check and turn them in a moment. They can run along the chariot pole, stand on the yoke, and get back into the chariot as quick as lightning. 34. The men of the 7th Legion were unnerved by these tactics, and it was just at the right moment that Caesar came to their rescue. At his approach the enemy halted and the soldiers recovered from their alarm. But as he considered the situation too hazardous for attacking or engaging in battle, he stayed where he was, and after a short interval led the legions back to camp. While these events kept all our men occupied, the natives who were still in the fields made off. There followed several days of continuous bad weather, which kept our men in camp and also prevented the enemy from attacking. During this time the natives sent messengers in all directions, who informed their people of the small numbers of our troops and pointed out what a good opportunity they had of getting booty and liberating themselves forever, if they could drive the Romans from their camp. By this means they quickly collected a large force of infantry and cavalry which advanced towards the camp. 35. Caesar foresaw that what had happened before would happen again. Even if the enemy were beaten, their speed would enable them to escape out of harm's way. Nevertheless, having luckily obtained about 30 horsemen whom Commius had brought across, he drew up the legions in battle formation in front of the camp. Before the engagement had lasted long, the enemy were overpowered and took to flight. The Romans pursued as far as their strength enabled them to run, killing a number of the fugitives, and then set fire to all the buildings over a wide area and returned to camp. 36. The same day envoys came to Caesar to sue for peace. He demanded twice as many hostages as before, and ordered these to be brought to the continent, as the equinox was close at hand, and he thought it better not to expose his damaged ships to the dangers of a voyage in wintry weather. Taking advantage of a favourable wind, he set sail shortly after midnight, and the whole fleet reached the continent safely. 2 transports, however, failed to make the same harbour as the rest, and were carried a little farther south. 37. When about 300 soldiers had disembarked from these 2 ships and were pushing towards the camp, the Morini, whom Caesar had compelled to make peace before setting out for Britain, thought they saw a chance of obtaining booty and surrounded them, at first with only a small force, bidding them lay down their arms if they did not want to be killed. The Romans formed a ring and defended themselves, but in a short time the shouts of their assailants brought some 6,000 natives to the spot. On hearing what was happening, Caesar sent all the cavalry to their aid. Meanwhile the soldiers held the enemy's attack, fighting with the utmost bravery for over 4 hours, and killed a number of them at the cost of only a few men wounded. As soon as the cavalry came in sight, the Morini threw down their arms and fled, suffering very heavy casualties. 38. The next day Caesar sent Labienus against the rebellious Morini with the legions that had returned from Britain. As the marshes in which they had taken refuge the previous year were now dry, the natives had nowhere to retreat to, and nearly all fell into Labienus's hands. Sabinus and Cotta, however, who had led their legions into the territory of the Menapii, had to content themselves with destroying all the crops, cutting the corn, and burning the buildings, because all the inhabitants had concealed themselves in very dense forests. They then returned to Caesar, who arranged for all the legions to winter in Belgic territory. There he received the promised hostages from only 2 British tribes, the remainder neglected to send them. On the conclusion of these campaigns and the receipt of Caesar's dispatches, the Senate decreed a public thanksgiving of 20 days.